Good morning, brothers and sisters. Something a little different today. Um, as much as God gives me strength, as I find things to talk about during this time when we're not all able to go to church as often as we'd like, I want to try through technology to provide a little bit of spiritual food. Last week, the church celebrated all saints of the Russian church, and this Sunday we have one of those saints being celebrated. And in a little brief sermon I gave after Vigil last week, I said something about um, rather than understanding saints against the background of their history, it's interesting to understand history against the background of its saintly participants. And also, we know, some people know a lot about Russian history, some people know very little. But it's interesting to connect the names of these saints that we celebrate in church with the names of some other people we've heard before, even if we don't know an awful lot about Russian history. So you certainly can go and read the life of Saint Jonah of Moscow, whom we're celebrating tomorrow. But I wanted to give a few points that give interesting connections to the history. And then if you want to explore them more, you know where to go. So Saint Jonah lived in the 15th century. This was a turbulent time for early Russia. This is before the czars. This is when there were the great princes. The capital had recently moved to Moscow from Kiev. It was a time of invasions, but also Russia was starting to gain its strength against these invasions. The famous Battle of Kulikovo that Saint Sergius blessed Saint Dmitry of the Don to fight had been won, and so one branch of Tatar invasion had been cut off. But it was still a time of fear. It was not a time of a very powerful Russia at all. At this time, the Russian Church was a diocese of the Church of Constantinople. And at this time, the norm was for Constantinople to choose the leader of the Russian Church, who would have been the Metropolitan of Kiev, but at this time it was transitioning, and the person bearing the title of Metropolitan of Moscow would be considered the first hierarch of the Russian Church. At this point, Saint Jonah had been chosen for that position by the Russians themselves. And the norm was after someone who was already a bishop had been chosen to be elevated to metropolitan, the great prince would send a letter with him to Constantinople and ask the Patriarch of Constantinople to do that elevation. And that's what happened here. However, when Saint Jonah arrived at Constantinople, he found out that someone else had come in before him, and his name was Isidore, and laid claim to be Metropolitan of Moscow, and Constantinople had accepted his claim. So Saint Jonah went back to his job. He was the Bishop of Ryazan before this. What happened historically at this time is the Roman Church was trying to take advantage of the barbarian invasions and difficulties in the Eastern world to subjugate the Eastern Orthodox Church to Rome. And a council was called in Florence, and many of the Eastern patriarchates needed help from the West, needed armies, needed money, and they agreed to come to this. Isidore agreed to represent the Russian Church, but he was told by Great Prince Vasily II, father of Ivan the Great, not to betray orthodoxy. Yes, go to the meeting, but stand up for our interests and do not betray orthodoxy. Exactly the opposite is what happened. A majority of the Orthodox patriarchates accepted Rome's innovations. St. Mark of Ephesus pushed very strongly against them, and Isidore, representing Russia, accepted as well. As soon as he came back, this was rejected by the Russian people. The Russian people wanted orthodoxy and not to be subject to Rome, and Isidore was deposed. I believe he eventually full on became a Catholic. I don't remember. After this, it was time again to choose a metropolitan, and now feeling betrayed by Constantinople, feeling betrayed by the other Orthodox who had accepted union with Rome at Florence, the Russian bishops decided to choose and confirm the Metropolitan of Moscow all by themselves without checking in with Constantinople, who they had seen at this time as definitely falling into heresy through their union with the Catholics. And St. Jonah was the first of the Russian metropolitans chosen and confirmed 100% inside the Russian church. And he was a very excellent metropolitan. You can read the life of him as a saint. I think we can all expect certain things from saintly people. I'm not going to go into that. Again, I want to connect this with some historical events. Even though the Russians had won the Battle of Kulikovo about 70 years earlier, the Tatars eventually invaded Moscow. And at that time, St. Jonah arranged molebens, prayer services, arranged processions and prayers. And as a result of all of this, very few people, some accounts say only one person, died in this attack on Moscow. I'm not sure if that's meant to be taken literally true or not. But the Tatars had confusion in their own ranks after these molebens, after these prayer services served by the Metropolitan, and they fled. And Moscow was delivered, and St. Jonah continued his rule and ended his life relatively in peace. The year after he died is the year that Ivan III, so-called Ivan the Great, ascended to the throne. And under his time, the Tatars were basically totally expelled from Russia under his astute leadership. So there's some interesting side notes where the context of this particular saint that we celebrate today is in history, things you've heard of before. Ivan the Great, you've heard of. You've heard of the Council of Florence. You know about the history of the Russian Church as part of Constantinople. And here's a very interesting saint that we celebrate today that's in the middle of all of that. So whether you've got an invitation to be at church tonight or not, look it up, find online the canon to this saint and read it at home if you're not going to be in service. If you are in service, I hope this prepares you to listen a little bit more closely to what we say tonight in the service about this saint.